Are we working? Yes. Fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to Scientia, especially on this beautiful fall afternoon day. My name is Jim Pomerantz. I'm a professor of psychology here at Rice and the former director of Scientia. I'm filling in today for Susan McIntosh, who is the current director of Scientia, but who is on assignment in Africa. She's an anthropologist who's doing an archaeological dig there, leaving us all behind in Houston. So it's great to have as our speaker today Dr. Amy McGuire from the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. It will be my pleasure to introduce her in just a moment, but I wanted to take a second or two to tell you briefly about some of our other programs. As you may know, our theme for this current year at Scientia is Biopolitics, so we're focusing on the many ways in which the biological sciences intersect with law, policy, politics, morality, and ethics. And toward that end, we've had three speakers who preceded Amy so far this year, beginning with John Alford, who's a political scientist here at Rice, then David Eagleman from Baylor College of Medicine and Neuroscience, and just last month we heard from Peggy Bartlett, who came to us from Emory University in Georgia. We similarly have a full program awaiting you in the spring term, starting on Tuesday, January 13th, with Neil Lane, speaking on the topic of scientists speaking out. Neil, as I'm sure many of you in the room know, has been for many years a faculty member at Rice and was our provost before going to Washington to be the director of the National Science Foundation and then President Clinton's science advisor. So that will be exciting. Following Neil, in February, we're going to be doing something a little different on February 11th with an evening program that will be a panel discussion led by three people, Dean William Brinkley, Bill Brinkley from Baylor College of Medicine again, Texas Freedom Network President Kathy Miller, and a teacher, Richard Person, from the Academy of Science and Technology in Conroe, and they're going to be talking about the politics of teaching evolution in Texas. So that could be a barn burner. Then in March, we will have our annual Bachner Lecture, and that, too, is an evening event on Monday, March 9th. And the Bachner will be delivered by Nicholas Rose, who's a professor of sociology and director of the BIOS Center for the Study of Bioscience at the London School of Economics. And then finally, rounding out the spring term in April, we'll hear from Jimmy Reardon from the Sociology Department at UC Santa Cruz. So we've got a very busy year in store for us. For those of you who are members of the Rice University Faculty Club, also known as the Cohen House, we've instituted a new program about a year ago called Table Talk, which is an informal speaker series whose key ideas are good conversation, good food, and above all, speed and simplicity. So our next Table Talk happens to be the day after tomorrow, this Thursday, when we'll hear from Michael Emerson from Rice's Department of Sociology. So if you're a member of the faculty club or have a friend who is, please head on over there, go through the line, get your food as usual, and come on upstairs to Esther's room, where Michael will start speaking at 12:15 promptly and end at 12:45, so we can all get on quickly with our busy lives. Copies of these program events, by the way, are available. Ellen Butler has them outside in the room where our reception will be held. I should also mention a brief advertisement for the DeLange Conference that will be coming up here on campus March 2nd through 4th. On transforming the metropolis, creating sustainable and humane cities. So that's like an all-day-long event, the first day of which is more oriented toward the public, and second day of which is more shop talk for insiders, but you're welcome to attend. All these events, needless to say, are free of charge. So now for the reason why we all came here today, to hear not from me, but from Dr. Amy L. McGuire. Amy is an assistant professor of medicine and medical ethics with the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine, as I've mentioned. She received her BA in psychology, my field, summa cum laude from University of Pennsylvania, and then went on to get her JD here in Houston, summa cum laude, University of Houston in the year 2000, and then finally her PhD in medical humanities from the Institute for Medical Humanities at UTMB Galveston. Amy's research focuses on the legal and ethical issues in genetics and genomics, with a particular interest in genetic research and personalized genomic medicine. She's currently studying research participant attitudes toward broad data sharing in genome-wide association studies and consumer expectations regarding clinical integration of direct-to-consumer personal genome testing services. In fact, if you check in the seats below you, there's a mouth swab that she's asking that you use and deposit on the desk here on your way out to the reception afterwards. Her research is funded by the NHGRI-ELSI. I'm sure you all know what that means, but I had to look it up. It's the National Human Genome Research Institute's program on legal, ethical, and social implications. She's also funded by the Greenwald Foundation Faculty Scholars Program in Bioethics. She's a member of the Personalized Healthcare Working Group for the American Health Information Community, the Working Group on Participant and Data Protection for the Genetic Association Information Network, and interestingly is on the advisory board for the X Prize in Genomics. In a relatively brief career, Amy's already begun collecting a number of honors and citations, including nearly a dozen educational awards from UTMB and from University of Houston, and this year was selected for Baylor's Leadership Development Program. Amy currently sits on the editorial board, for the journal Genomic Medicine. So, with no further ado, let me ask you to turn off your cell phones and anything else that makes noise and tune in to Amy McGuire, whose topic for us today is Genomic Horoscopes and the Future of Personalized Medicine. Amy.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for coming out today. I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this very interesting lecture series, and I'm going to be talking to you about genomic horoscopes and the future of personalized medicine this afternoon. So I'd like to begin by just talking a little bit about what is this concept of personalized medicine, or personalized genomic medicine, as some people call it. It's been talked about quite a lot in the last couple months, last couple years. And if you read this quote, you might think that this was published in the New York Times last week or last month, but this is actually a quote from almost 20 years ago. And it says, "In the not-so-distant future, we can expect to walk into a physician's office for an annual physical and walk out with a blueprint of our genetic inheritance and with the knowledge of the most likely cause of our own death." And I think a lot of people think of this as sort of the vision or the goal of what we call personalized medicine or personalized genomic medicine. And I would argue that we're a little bit closer to achieving the first part of this goal, which is being able to generate a blueprint of our genetic inheritance, but maybe a little bit further from the second part, which is actually knowing what that means and understanding what implications it has for our health and our future life. So as this definition implies, most of the conversations around personalized medicine really center around understanding and having access to the information that's encoded within the human genome. And so what I'd like to talk about today are really two areas of research and commercialization that are trying to lead us towards this path of personalized medicine or personalized genomic medicine. The first is what are the new initiatives in genome research, and the second is sort of this parallel field of what's being done with regard to direct-to-consumer personal genome testing or commercial genomics. And the goal of both of these is ultimately, I think, to generate the knowledge that we might need to be able to impact medical care and clinical care. And so I'll say a little bit about what I think needs to be done at the end in order to achieve that goal. So let me begin with the recent initiatives in genome research. And I think it's sometimes easiest to classify these based on two major categories. There are many research initiatives that are currently underway all over the country that are really designed to try to advance the technology and build shared resources. A couple of examples of these are large-scale sequencing studies and personal genome sequencing research. And then there are those studies that are really aiming to try to understand what is the functional significance of human genetic variation. So we know that we all have some variation in our genomes, and what is the functional significance of that? What does that mean for health and disease? And one area of this that's gained a lot of attention has to do with pharmacogenomics, where you're trying to understand how genetic variation affects individuals' response to different drugs that they're taking. And there's been a lot of exciting advances in that area. So with regard to large-scale sequencing studies, the first major one was the Human Genome Project. It took 13 years and $2.7 billion to complete, and its goal was to create a reference genome of what does the human genome look like. It was a compilation of many different individuals from different populations around the world, and it created this sort of sample human genome. Building on the Human Genome Project, there have been other large-scale sequencing studies, such as the International HapMap Project. The International HapMap Project aimed to try to create a catalog of all the human genetic variation. So it looked across the human genome and looked for what are the single letter changes in the genome that occur at a frequency of 5% or greater. And those single letter changes are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And so a lot of times when you're testing and looking for genetic variation, you're looking for those single letter changes, or those SNPs. There's also a new initiative that has been funded within the last year or two, which is called the 1,000 Genomes Project. And this is trying to build on the International HapMap Project, and it's trying to identify genetic variation that occurs at 1% variation or greater. And it's also looking for things in the genome that don't have to do with those single letter changes, but rather have to do with large insertions or deletions in your chromosomes. One of the main policies around these large-scale sequencing studies since the beginning of the Human Genome Project has been the public release of all generated sequence data. And this policy makes a lot of sense because I just told you that the human genome took 13 years and $2.7 billion to complete. It was an international collaboration. And the idea is that if you're going to advance research as quickly as possible and advance the technology, you need to make easily accessible all of the generated sequence data that you have. It was very time-consuming, very expensive to generate sequence data. So if you could put all of the data that you generate out on a publicly available database, then researchers around the world could access it without having to jump through loopholes, and they could advance the research as quickly as possible. So any data sharing policy or data release policy has to balance that utility of having the information out there for scientists to access and the privacy protections of the individuals from whom that information came. And the traditional means of protecting privacy in this area have been by de-identifying the information, which means that you only release the genetic information, so those single letters, the ACTGs that make up an individual's genome, and you don't link it to any other personally identifying information like the person's name, their birth date, their social security number, their medical record, those sorts of things. And it was thought that if you just release that sequence or genomic information, then you would be adequately protecting individual privacy. Of course, the problem is that we each have our own unique genome. And so it became apparent within the last couple years that you actually could uniquely identify an individual on the basis of just that genomic information, even if you didn't have any other information out there. There was this very influential article that was published in Science in 2004 where they looked at how much information you actually had to have in order to uniquely identify an individual. And they found that if you had just 30 to 80 statistically independent SNP positions, which are those single nucleotide polymorphisms or changes in the genome, from an individual you could uniquely identify that it came from an individual and that was an individual's genome. And then, of course, if you have other information that's linked to that, then the identifiability becomes much more rapid. In current genomic studies, they release and sequence hundreds of thousands of SNP positions for each individual. So this is clearly a much smaller amount of genetic information that you'd have to have. And a question that I frequently get is, well, how could you actually identify somebody just from that information? And there was an article that was published in Science last year that came out of a workshop that I participated in at the National Human Genome Research Institute, where we tried to look at actually how could you identify an individual. And Bill Laurence and Francis Collins published this article and identified really 3 ways that you can identify an individual on the basis of this genetic or genomic information. The first is that you could have a reference sample. So you'd actually be surprised how many people have access to your DNA. Certainly, if you go to a doctor's visit or to a hospital, they take blood work all the time. Oftentimes, that blood work is stored. Insurance companies frequently will collect blood samples and other types of biological specimens. And you could, if somebody has a reference sample and knows that it's your reference sample, your sample, then they could sequence just a very small portion of it, which is actually quite easy to do and not that expensive, and match it to a particular database and then get a whole lot of information about you when they identify that your genome is in that database. The second thing that people worry about is that you could actually link this information to information that's available in other public databases. Again, every state has publicly available census databases where you have tons of information about people just when they get a social security number or whenever they get into the system. So you could link the information that's publicly available in those databases with the information that's available in these research databases and potentially pull up somebody's genome. And finally, they talk about genomic profiling, which seems a little sci-fi to me, but I guess scientists worry about this, where we may get to the point in the not-so-distant future where you could actually reconstruct what somebody might look like on the basis of their genomic information. It could tell you things like bone structure, skin color, things like that. So you could actually reconstruct what a picture of this person might look like and identify somebody that way. So there have been several policy responses to this concern about the fact that we may not be striking the right balance between advancing research and protecting individual privacy, and what should we do about that given this new information that we have about identifiability. One of the responses has been to pull back from these publicly accessible databases and put this genomic information that we generate and research into databases that have restricted access, which means you have to go through some level of control to get access to it. It could be anything from signing in and getting a username and password to actually having to get prior approval from your institutional review board or something like that in order to access the data in these databases. The most common database now, or the most well-known database now, is at the NIH, and it's a database that all information from genome-wide association studies that are funded by the NIH goes into. It's called dbGaP. There's also been a tremendous amount of effort being poured into research on data security that I know very little about because this is about as technical as I get. But very interesting research and very important to try to protect the security of these databases so that hackers can't get into them. And most of the people I think that work in that field are actually hackers themselves, so they know what it requires. There's also been efforts to to change the legislation to protect people from the harms that might accrue if you do get access to their genetic information or genomic information. So a lot of people are concerned, well, why do you care if somebody has access to your genomic information? And probably the most common response is, well, I don't want them to use it against me to discriminate for health insurance or employment purposes, those sorts of things. So we recently passed a federal law called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and this provides a federal floor and level of protection and prohibits health insurance companies and employers from using genetic information to discriminate against individuals in coverage decisions. There are other laws that have also been proposed at the state and federal level. And finally, there's been a lot more attention being given to what kind of informed consent are we getting from research participants. So are they actually being told that their information is going to be shared? And we recognize that people have a right to privacy, but that right is not absolute, and they can choose to take a privacy risk if they'd like to. So the argument here is that if you inform them that there's this privacy risk associated with their participating in the research, then they may choose to take that risk and participate anyways. And so we just need to be transparent in the informed consent process. One of the issues that has come up in the last couple weeks that's generated a lot of policy attention has been that it has always been, so since the last couple years we've known that you can individually identify somebody based on their individual genomic information. But we still publicly release in these databases and also in publications and things like that aggregate genomic information, which is that we have all of our study participants. We found this variant at this frequency among our population. And just in the last last month, there was an article that was published in PLOS Genetics that showed that you can actually uniquely identify an individual from this aggregate data. And you have to have the reference sample from the individual, but you can match it up and pick out the fact that they're in that pool of individuals. And the implications that this has is that if you are participating in a study of, let's say, an HIV study, and you have cases and controls in your study, so you have individuals who have HIV and individuals who don't have HIV, and you publicly release the aggregate data, and then you match up an individual, you can know whether they're in the cases or the controls, so you can actually know whether they have HIV or not. This has generated a lot of policy attention, and as a result, the NIH database that I just mentioned, dbGaP, pulled back all of the aggregate data from public access, so now it's in their restricted access database only, and you have to get prior approval through a data access committee to look at it. This also happened overseas as well with some of the databases, and some scientists argued that this was actually kind of overkill and that we shouldn't be quite so concerned about this, and this was too much of a hyper reaction to this research study that was published. Interestingly, some people have looked at the identifiability issue and said, what are we spending so much time and trouble and money and effort to protect individual privacy? If we all have our information out there on the web, then it won't be such a big deal. So they are advocating just everybody putting all their information out there on the internet. One of these groups is at Harvard, and George Church leads this group. He's a very well-known scientist, genomic scientist at Harvard, and he has a project called the Personal Genome Project. He has 10 individuals who have agreed to get their genomes sequenced and to put all of their genomic information as well as their photos, their medical information, medical history, tissue samples, everything out on the internet and be fully identified. Interestingly, the Harvard IRB required, Institutional Review Board, they required that these individuals, in order for them to really understand what risks that they were taking in putting this information out there, they had to have a master's in genetics or the equivalent. I'm not quite sure that qualifies you to understand what risks you're taking, but that was the requirement that they had. The first round of the genomic information was published a couple weeks ago, and there was a big kind of media frenzy about this. And they are planning to expand this project to include 100,000 individuals. All of them, of course, will not have a master's in genetics. That would be impossible. But surprisingly, there's quite a bit of interest in participating in this. And I understand from people who are involved in the project that rather than recruiting, they're actually getting phone calls of people saying, hey, I want to do this, I want to do this. Okay, so those are large-scale sequencing studies. There's also, in the last year, we've been able to actually sequence an individual's entire genome. And the first two genomes that were entirely sequenced were those of Dr. Jim Watson, who was one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA. In one of my earlier slides, you saw a picture of him and Dr. Crick looking at the model of DNA that they had worked on. And Craig Venter, who's another scientist who led the private initiative of the Human Genome Project. And both of these individuals had their genomes entirely sequenced. They posted them on the web in a very identified way. The photo of Dr. Watson up there on the left is him at Baylor with the director of our Human Genome Sequencing Center, Richard Gibbs, on the left, and the founder of 454 Life Sciences, which is the company that built the sequencing machines that were used to sequence his DNA, Jonathan Rothberg in the middle. I was involved in this project as an ethics consultant, and there they are handing him a miniature hard drive with his entire genome sequence on it. That was at a press conference on May 31st of 2007. Venter's genome was published in October of 2007. The paper didn't actually come out until 2008, so there's a lot of debate about who went first, but I'm not going to get into that. What's interesting and important is that when I told you that the Human Genome Project took 13 years and $2.7 billion, Dr. Watson's genome took about a month and about $1 million to sequence. Now, understanding what's in the genome has taken much longer, and we still don't have a full grasp of that. But you can just see how the technology has advanced so dramatically over the last several years. There were two other whole genome sequences that were published within the last month in Nature. One was from a Han Chinese individual, and the other was from a Yoruban. And the cost of sequencing those individuals was less than $500,000. One of the major ethical issues with regard to genomic research and whole genome sequencing has to do with whether we ought to be giving these individuals back information about them that's generated when we look at their genome. So the return of research results. And I think it's helpful when we talk about the return of research results to really distinguish between research results and then to further distinguish that between the individual research results of this is what we found in your genome versus the aggregate results of this is what our study tells us, versus incidental findings, which are those things that we're not actually looking for, and they may have proven clinical significance in previous studies, versus the raw data, which is just the genome sequence that we're generating. And when we think about returning research results, I think there are several issues that come up. In the background here, you can see actual raw data from a hypothetical individual. This is what the genome looks like. So returning raw data of this nature for most people will mean absolutely nothing. So what we'll probably want to give them is a much more analyzed version of what did we find within your genome. And the most important thing that I think we need to think about is when we're determining what information to give them is what's the validity of the information, meaning does it tell us what we think it tells us, and what's the utility of it, which is what's the significance of it, how are you going to use it, what implications does it have for you or your health. Another thing we need to think about is who's going to give back this information. In most types of research, the researcher and the participant might have a very close relationship, at least they've met and interacted. In this kind of research, oftentimes the researcher has no relationship with the participant, has never met the person, and when you're dealing with data sharing, you might have a downstream researcher who really has no relationship with the participant. So there's a question of whether that individual has a responsibility to the participant, what's the nature of that responsibility, and should they be the person giving back those research results. And finally, if you're going to give back research results, how are you going to do it? Do you need to do one-on-one genetic counseling to ensure that the individual really understands the information that you're providing them? We certainly don't have enough genetic counselors in our country to handle this burden if that's what we're going to require. Can you do it in the form of a newsletter or some sort of electronic exchange? And there have been several models that have been proposed with regard to that. Okay, and finally, when we're talking about initiatives in genome research, I want to talk a little bit about the studies that are aiming to look at the functional significance of human genetic variation. And these are typically called genome-wide association studies. And this year, Science magazine named human genetic variation, which we understand through genome-wide association studies, as the breakthrough of the year. Most of these studies are done looking at genetic associations with common and complex disorders. And one of the major ethical challenges with regard to this has to do with how are we getting informed consent for people who are participating in these studies. Usually when you participate in one of these genome-wide association studies, you go to an investigator or your physician and they ask you to take like a blood sample that they're going to do genetic analysis on. They usually store it and they use it in future research, and they don't really know what kind of research they're going to be doing on it. And they have data sharing of your genetic information, and they don't really know what kind of data sharing or who's going to access it. So there's a lot of uncertainty associated with this kind of research, and there's a lot of future research use that we can't specify. And so there's a lot of questions about whether people can actually give informed consent to participate in that type of research or not. Another major challenge is ensuring that people actually understand what you're trying to tell them. And that they understand the nature and meaning of the information that you're getting back from genetic studies. I can tell you from my experience that working with research participants, they often assume that you're going to do the study and you're going to know whether they are going to get cancer or they're going to get epilepsy or whatever. And so you have to explain to them the difference between what is a statistically significant finding in a genome-wide association study and what is clinically meaningful or significant information. And oftentimes those are very discordant things. I think there's a major problem in people having a sense of genetic determinism, which is that what I just pointed out of if I have X gene, I will get Y disease. And this tendency towards genetic determinism is really perpetuated, I think, in our mass media. If you look at any Time magazine cover over the last couple of years, you can get a whole bunch of examples. This is one where it indicates that there's an IQ gene out there, that if you've got this gene, you'll know how smart you're going to be or how smart your kids are going to be or whatever. There's one that even suggests you have an infidelity gene. So it says infidelity, it may be in our genes. And I presented this Time magazine cover once, and one of the audience members came up to me afterwards and said, infidelity is not what's about what's in your genes, it's about what's out of your genes that counts. I thought that was cute. But certainly this is a gross misunderstanding of how genetics works if you think there's this sort of infidelity gene. And they've even suggested a God gene, which seems quite interesting to me. And finally, I think the big elephant in the room when we talk about policy around genetic studies or genome-wide association studies has to do with what obligations, if any, do we owe to close genetic relatives. And I think this becomes particularly salient when we're talking about publicly releasing your genomic information, like George Church's Personal Genome Project or Dr. Watson or Craig Venter. So should we have to get permission from their identical twin to release that information? Certainly it reveals a lot of information about their identical twin. It reveals all the information about their identical twin. What about their brother or sister or their child or parent? So how far out do you have to go and what are our obligations to those relatives? And this is a big policy question that I think a lot of people don't want to touch because it can be very, very messy, but it's starting to percolate in the policy discussions that I've been involved in. So now I want to switch gears a little bit to our parallel track from genetic research and talk a little bit about this initiative with regard to direct-to-consumer personal genome testing. So how many of you have heard of companies like 23andMe or Navigenics or Biomarker or DecodeMe? A couple of you? Okay, so these are really interesting companies. 23andMe is probably the most well-known one. One of the co-founders of it is a woman who is the wife of the founder of Google. So they have a lot of money and a lot of visibility and a lot of connections. And what they do, they just drop their price from $1,000 to $399. So for $399, you can sign up. They will send you a spit kit, which is a vial that you spit saliva into and send it back to them. And then they will sequence your genome and give you all this information about what is your relative risk of getting all these various diseases or disorders compared to the general population. What is your relative risk of being a fast runner or having lots of earwax or things like that? So it's not all medical information, it's other information as well. They're doing tons of other stuff in these companies. Many of them are doing research initiatives. Some of them have even talked about doing social networking on the basis of your genome, which totally boggles my mind. A lot of ancestry tracing, those sorts of things. But these companies have gotten to be very, very, very well known within the last year. In fact, this technology was named the Invention of the Year in Time magazine just within the last month for 2008. And I think one of the major questions around this type of direct-to-consumer personal genome testing is what kind of information are they providing to consumers? And specifically, are they providing medical information or diagnostic information? There was a big legal dispute about this because several months ago, the state of New York and the state of California sent out cease and desist letters to 13 of these companies saying, you cannot sell your product to individuals in our state because you're in violation of state law because you're engaged in the unlicensed practice of medicine. You are providing diagnostic information without the appropriate involvement of a healthcare professional to order the tests and to deliver the information to individuals. So there's a lot of debate. Those companies, by the way, many of them have responded to that. Some of them have hired physicians to work on staff, arguing that these physicians have no professional physician-patient relationship with the consumers, but they order the tests and provide the information. That's problematic in and of itself. But the companies themselves basically say on their websites, we don't provide medical advice, and the services can't be used for health ascertainment and disease purposes. So reliance on any information provided is solely at your own risk. They consider this recreational genomics. This is from 23andMe. Navigenics takes a little bit of a different stance, and they involve physicians a little bit more and try to sell their product a little bit more as a medical product to provide medical information. So I wanted to look at what actually are they testing for, and the Genetics and Public Policy Center at Hopkins put together this list. I know you can't read it. It's not, you don't have to read it, but this is a list. On the left is all the companies that provide direct-to-consumer genetic testing, and across the top is a list of all of the various types of diseases and disorders that they're testing for. There are things here like predisposition to Alzheimer's disease, addiction, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, diabetes, obesity, infertility, cardiovascular disease, cancer. I'm sorry. So you can see from this list that even though they're claiming this isn't medical information, this information certainly has medical implications. And what's somewhat problematic is that the information that they're providing to consumers is based on the newest research that's being generated through genome-wide association studies. And what consumers need to understand is that difference between statistically significant and clinically significant, because you might have a genome-wide association study that shows a statistically significant association between a particular gene and an increased risk for cardiovascular disease, say. But what does that mean for the individual participant? It may mean, or the individual consumer. It may mean nothing. It may mean that if you have that gene, you have an increased risk of, you used to have a risk of cardiovascular disease over your lifetime of about 1%, and now your risk is about 1.6%. So what does that mean for you? What does that mean for your clinical decision making? Probably not much. So with regard to, one of the things that I've been really interested in is how is this type of direct-to-consumer stuff going to get integrated with clinical care, and what should we in the medical center and as healthcare providers be thinking about? 23andMe and many of the other services, their advice to consumers with regard to this information is talk to your doctor. If you have any questions, contact your physician. And the advice to physicians, at least by some commentaries, this is from a New England Journal of Medicine article published a couple months ago, is don't give advice on the basis of this information. So provide only a general statement about the poor sensitivity and positive predictive value of these test results. They're concerned that we don't know the validity of the information that's being provided to consumers, and we don't know the utility of much of the information that's being provided to consumers, so you should not be counseling consumers or patients on the basis of this information. So I decided to take a first glance at what are the expectations of potential consumers, and I didn't have access to the actual consumers. So as sort of a pilot study, we did an online survey of Facebook.com users, and this is because we guessed or hypothesized that this might be a demographic of individuals who could be among the first users of these types of direct-to-consumer companies. And so this is unpublished data, but we did a survey with 1,087 individuals. The average age was 35 with a standard deviation of 12. There were 83% Caucasian, 73% female, and 60% of them had at least a college education. And we asked them a variety of things. But the first thing we asked them is, have you heard of these companies? Have you used them? And if not, would you use them? And we found that 6% of those respondents of the 1,000 said they have used these types of services. It's not clear whether they've actually used this type of whole genome services, or if some of them were talking more about the ancestry companies that do ancestry tracing on the basis of your genome. 30% said they would not use these services, and 64% said they would be interested in using these services. For those who would be interested in using them, we asked them why, what interests you, and over 80% said they just had a general curiosity, which I think is a really interesting thing of people as information seekers. More than 70% wanted to see if a specific disease ran in their family or was genetic. And about 40% said they wanted to learn about their genetic makeup without having to go through a healthcare provider, which is quite interesting. They could choose more than one answer, obviously, which is why it doesn't add to 100%. For those who were not interested in using the services, over 50% just didn't think the information would be useful. 40% were concerned about the cost. This is when it was about $1,000, so who knows how that would change now that the price has been dropped. And about 20% were concerned about their privacy and about the potential return of unwanted information. We then asked our participants or our respondents whether they considered the information that you would get back from these companies to be a medical diagnosis or diagnostic information. And of those who have used the services, that small 6% said they did consider it a medical diagnostic information. Almost 40% of those who were interested in using the services would consider it diagnostic, and just over 20% who wouldn't use the services said they would think it would be diagnostic information. And finally, we asked them, what professional obligation do physicians have to be involved in helping you interpret these results? For those who reported, that 6% who reported that they had used this type of service, more than 50%, about 55%, said they had spoken to their physician about the results that they got. Almost 80% of those who said they would use the service said that they would ask their physician for help in interpreting the results. And just over 60% of all of our respondents said that they felt that physicians had a professional obligation to help individuals understand the results that they get from these direct-to-consumer personal genome companies. So, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this issue, and I think that I was trying to come up with some conclusions about this personal direct-to-consumer stuff, and I think that I get asked about it quite a lot, and I write about it quite a lot, and I think that people have a right to this information. I certainly think it's interesting and deserves further research to understand why people want this information and what they're doing with this information. I do believe that there should be increased regulation, at least with regard to truth in marketing. There's very little regulation of these direct-to-consumer companies right now, and we need to at least make sure that they're giving the right information and correct information to potential consumers. I think physicians really need to think about the fact that at least our survey indicates that many potential consumers may go to physicians and seek their advice and their help. And so physicians do need to think about their role at least as an educator with regard to this information. However, if consumers demand follow-up treatment on the basis of this information, most of which is not clinically significant at this point in time, then providing that follow-up may be an unjustified use of healthcare resources. And finally, with regard to the direct-to-consumer piece, I think there's a really interesting question raised about what about kids. So most of these companies actually allow you to test kids, which is somewhat in contradiction to most of the genetic testing guidelines, which say you shouldn't test kids for adult onset disorders until they reach the age of 18 and they can decide for themselves if they want to have this information. But most of these companies allow you to test kids. And they're doing it not just for medical information. This is a New York Times article from, it says November 30th, but I think it was October 30th, just a couple days ago. And it says, November 30th. I'm a month behind. Thanks. A couple days ago. It says, born to run, little ones get tested for sports genes. So they're using these services to test kids to see what sports they might be good at or bad at, and then make decisions about what teams to have them join. Just raises a lot of interesting issues. So finally, I just want to end before I open it up for questions by thinking a little bit about the ultimate goal of all this, which is how is it going to get integrated into clinical care, and what are some of the ethical considerations that we need to think about on the road to integrating this into clinical care. So I said before that most of the information that we get now from these genome-wide scans has very limited or unproven clinical utility. But the hope is that as research advances, we'll understand more about the role of genetics in health and disease, and we will get to a point where we can use this information to inform clinical decision making. So some of the things I think we need to think about as we move down that road is some of the practical concerns. Surveys show that most healthcare providers, and particularly primary care physicians, do not feel like they are in a position to provide information about genetics to their patients, and that's when you're asking them about single gene information. So when you get into this genome-wide scan stuff, they have no idea what you're talking about and are totally unprepared to counsel patients on the basis of that information. There are also many economic considerations. So I said it would be an unjustified use of healthcare resources at this point to do follow-up on information that doesn't have clinical utility or has unproven clinical utility. But as we start to learn more about this and it becomes indicated to do certain follow-up treatments and tests, then I think there are going to be a lot of questions about access and reimbursement for those services. And finally, I think the privacy concerns, which is what led me to this in the first place, is my interest in some of the privacy concerns, are going to persist even though we have this new federal law, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, because there will still be privacy concerns about the storage of this information. It's a vast amount of information. It's most useful when it's linked to an electronic health record and any other information that you have about the individual. And so the integration of that and the appropriate security of that is going to be a major issue, I think, in the future. And I will take questions.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was a great talk. As far as questions are concerned, oh, wonderful. We ask that you wait until the microphone makes it your way, not because your voice doesn't project well, but because this lecture is being recorded for the benefit of people who couldn't be here today. So we're now
Do these genetic tests give epigenetic information as well?
What kind of epigenetic information?
Well, whether the genes are turned on and turned off?
No, I think it tells you it tells you when you have particular variants, but the actual function of it is not done through these types of tests. I don't think so, but if there are other scientific colleagues in the room who have a better understanding, I will defer to them.
It's impressive to me that some of the problems you're talking about here have been around for a long time and haven't been solved yet. And I'm wondering to what extent people who are working in the field today are relying on research and practical clinical experience from cytogenetics people who were giving counseling on the basis of amniocentesis 25, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So some of the problems with regard to counseling and informing the public about this information? Communication with the individual. Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from the existing literature on genetic counseling and experience with genetic counseling. These aren't new issues. I think they're just getting more complicated as the technology and the research gets more complicated. But yeah, that's a really good point that, you know, everything and everybody wants everything to be novel and new. And one of the points I think that doesn't get made enough is this is another variant. It's not just in genetic counseling also, but physicians are very familiar with providing risk information of all different types, not just genetic risk information. And so we need to draw on that as well. Yeah.
You mentioned the study that's taking place in Cambridge with Dr. Church. Have they issued what they expect to find initially and a due date of this study?
So if you can go to their website and you can pull up all the information that's currently available for each participant, so each of the 10 participants are in there and it has lots of information about them. They've sequenced the exons, which is the exon regions of the genome for, I think last I looked, which was like last week, I think there were 4 individuals whose exon data was up there. So that's the scientific stuff, and I think they anticipate putting more information up there. With regard to the social implications of this, my understanding is that they are studying sort of what are the implications of people putting their information out there. And in fact, if you look at the list of 10 individuals who are participating, George Church being one of them, most of them have some sort of self-interest in participating in the study because they're either in the field or they're working on something similar. I know one of them at least is writing a book about this, those sorts of things. So I imagine that as this goes on, more information about the social implications of that kind of research project will come out. Yeah.
You're a person that has obviously thought about these issues more than most, and I'm wondering if you would mind sharing your personal decisions of whether you've been tested or would like to be tested and why you arrived at that conclusion.
Yeah, so this is my personal conundrum. I have not been tested. I don't think I want to be tested, although every once in a while I get a little bit curious about it. And I have thought a lot about it. And I think it has, I'm very interested in cognitive biases and how they influence our decision making about things. And so I've thought a lot about it in that context. And knowing what I know about the limitations of the information, I still think that I would put too much stock in the information that I get back. So I know that what they're going to tell me is not going to be very meaningful, but I think I would still ascribe meaning to it. And I know that about myself. And I think particularly with things that I have a family history of. So my mother has Parkinson's disease. And thinking about it in the very real way like that, I don't want that information. Even though the risk may not be any greater if I get a genetic predisposition versus a family history, I still don't want that information. My grandfather had Alzheimer's disease, same sort of thing. So I think it's a very individual decision, but I still, the reason I worry that people will ascribe more meaning to these results than they deserve is partly because I think I would do that in that circumstance. That's my personal take on it. Yeah.
Do the commercial companies publish information about error rates in their tests, or is that kind of information available? What are the error rates, for example, for a single gene?
I don't. Does anybody know the error rates? I would have to defer to my colleagues. But I think they do publish it, but it's sort of hidden in their website for the 4 scientists. I think you can get information about that. Most of them have a panel of experts, scientific experts, who try to help them figure these things out. There are error rates, though, and that's the truth in marketing piece that I think they need to be a little bit more transparent about what are those error rates, and also helping people understand. You know, this was on Oprah. I love Oprah. I get all my information from Oprah. But Oprah, a couple weeks ago, had the two co-founders of 23andMe on her show. And she had Dr. Oz. Does everybody know Dr. Oz? Dr. Oz is Oprah's doctor. And he's actually a very respected and well-known neurosurgeon at Columbia. But he does a lot of stuff with complementary and alternative medicine, and he's always on there talking about, you know, how to look younger and what the body looks like. He's very educational, so like Dr. Oz too. But she had this amazing television segment where she had the two co-founders of 23andMe on there, and they're talking about their product, and she's saying this is the invention of the year and what nice packaging and all that kind of stuff. And Dr. Oz gets on and says, I did this and it changed my life. And she says, really, how did it change your life? And he says, well, for instance, I found out that I'm at higher risk than the general population for having macular degeneration, so now I eat more leafy green vegetables. And I found out that I'm 30% lower than the general population risk of getting prostate cancer, so now I don't have to do things like get PSA screening and rectal exams, which, not sure if he was being sarcastic or if he was being serious. It certainly came across as him being serious. But I think that's one of the dangers. This is a very, very well-known physician. So not just knowing error rates, but knowing just because it pulls up a particular gene that you have a risk, you know, a genetic predisposition for something, doesn't mean that, you know, if it's negative, it doesn't mean that you don't have other genetic predispositions. For example, they test for breast cancer, but they don't test the BRCA genes. So if you're told based on what they're testing for that you're at lower than the normal population risk of having breast cancer, but they haven't tested the BRCA genes, it's misinformation. So I think people need to just be aware of what they're getting.
I was just wondering if the insurance industry has weighed in on this at all in any formal way, or aspects of the insurance industry. I mean, you sort of started to allude to it in this last slide, but I'm just wondering if people are starting to talk about reimbursement, and just they must have some opinions about paying for this.
I don't actually know how the insurance industry has weighed in on this with regard to reimbursement. Usually the things that get reimbursed, they get reimbursed when it becomes standard of care to order them. So there's sort of this chicken and egg thing of how does, you know, as you're advancing and you're always on the cusp of doing new things, how do you set the standard of care, and, you know, when do you get reimbursed? We had an interesting conversation one time at Baylor when we were talking about building this new hospital and, you know, centering it around being 5 years ahead of standard of care in everything that we do. And the comment was made that if you're always 5 years ahead of standard of care, you're not going to get reimbursed for anything that you're doing because the insurance companies don't reimburse for things that are not standard of care. So, you know, that's an interesting discussion. I'm not sure where the insurance companies are with this, or what's being reimbursed and what's not.
You mentioned something about regulation. These are unregulated industries, these companies that will do your personal genome test. What would you consider to be the primary regulatory steps that need to be taken?
Yeah, good question. I'm not really sure. This is something I've started to think about but haven't gotten totally into. Is the FDA the right person, the right agency to regulate? Are they qualified to do that? What should they be regulating for safety and efficacy of these tests before they're put on the market? Or should we go for something like a lower threshold and just look at truth in marketing? I'm not sure I've thought enough about it to really know where I stand on that, but I think it deserves a lot of attention. So I think there are several different possibilities. Some people have suggested a whole separate regulatory system for it. I'm not sure if that's necessary or not. But Kathy Hudson's group, the Center for Public Policy at Hopkins, has actually done probably the most work on thinking about regulation of these, but it's still very much being debated.
I wanted to follow up on the question you were asked earlier about whether you'd want to be tested yourself. This is a question that I and probably others have been following for a long time. The first time I thought about it was probably over 25 years ago when Arlo Guthrie was trying to decide whether to be tested for Huntington's chorea, which his father, the famous folk singer Woody Guthrie, had. And I was thinking about fear as being one of the main reasons why people might decide not to go ahead with that kind of testing. You were mentioning that you might over-rely on the information, but I was trying to reconcile that with the fact that many, say, couples who are about to have a child don't want to know the gender of the child is coming. And in that case, fear wouldn't be a factor, and certainly privacy concerns wouldn't be a factor. And many of those people say, well, I just don't want to mess with it. It's just not right to look into this box. And I'm wondering whether that attitude plays a role in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think more work needs to be done on actually looking at people. There is several research projects that are now underway, I think, looking at people who are getting this testing, but as interesting are people who are choosing not to get the testing and what their motivations are. Now, I'm a lawyer, so just because I said I wouldn't get tested today doesn't mean I won't change my mind next week. But, you know, and I think it also has something to do with, can you do something about it, right? I mean, if there's something that you can do about it when you get the information, then it gives you a sense. A lot of these companies actually advertise and use the rhetoric of empowerment. We're empowering individuals with this information. And there's been some criticism of that, saying information doesn't empower if you can't do anything about it. Just having the information doesn't empower. And there's a debate about whether that's empowerment or not. But yeah, I think there are things other than fear that are motivating people either to get tested or not to get tested. And I wonder if people regret their decision ever or feel like it was a good decision, or, you know. And it'll be interesting, the more people that get tested, whether the culture changes about how we view this information.
You might, too, get a call from a football recruiter. Well, absent any other hands, let me thank Amy for a wonderful talk, and let me invite all of you to join Amy and the rest of us just outside in the foyer for a reception. So thank you, Amy.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.